I'm going to skip the music this time because I'm kind of on a roll. Um, but this is the third part of early Christians. I was talking about how the in the western part of Europe, there is no longer a single centralized control over what used to be the Roman Empire. Um, in fact, what we see as the end of the Roman Empire comes in 476. Um, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the single centralized government of the remnants of the Roman Empire continues on. Uh, and there are various reasons for this. For one thing, the eastern part of the Roman Empire was economically stronger. It had various ways of making money. There were large cities in the east, at least four major cities, and in those cities you had things like manufacturing. Um, you know, it was a diverse economy. It wasn't just agricultural. In the western part of the former Roman Empire, um, it was agricultural, and the government could only support itself by taxing farmers, which was more and more difficult to do. Also, the people who were being protected by the army were not getting the kind of protection they used to get, and so they were less willing to pay taxes for something that they weren't really getting. So the Western Empire begins to lose its ability to extract resources of the people, so it doesn't have as much tax revenue as it used to, and it ends up not being able to provide the army, which gives the people in Western Europe one more reason not to pay their taxes. So the whole old economic and governmental structure of Western Europe begins to fall apart. It's being replaced by these smaller governments I told you about, where the barbarians are in charge. The last Roman emperor, who was kind of descended from the old Romans who had been in control before, is deposed in 476 and is replaced by a barbarian. But at the and formally, officially, this represents the end of the Roman Empire, because once there are no more Roman emperors, there is no more Roman Empire. But I have the feeling that at the time, it wasn't really considered to be that big a deal, because the Roman emperors hadn't been functioning as such for a considerable amount of time at that point. The real actions of government had been managed and taken over by these various barbarian groups. So if you want to say that the Roman Empire ended in 476, well, go ahead, because that's a justifiable attitude. But actually, the Roman Empire had ended long before. The deposition of this final Roman emperor was sort of the coup de grace, the kiss of death, whatever you call it. Teachers all have these Christmas mugs. The person who took over in actually not Rome, because as I pointed out, this the functioning capital of the Western Roman Empire had been moved to Ravenna. And the first person to take control was this non-Roman soldier named Odoacer. And he had the sensible idea of sending a message to Zeno, who was at that time the emperor in the East, and saying, I'm not rebelling against you. I recognize you as the emperor of the whole Roman Empire, which didn't really exist any longer. But in fact, that was only a matter of form. He wasn't really doing anything because the Eastern Roman emperor told him to. And that was kind of irritating to the Eastern Roman emperor Zeno. So Zeno sent to the western part of Europe one of the people that he trusted, Theodoric the Ostrogoth. And he says, go and take over the government of the Roman West on my behalf. Theodoric was an interesting guy. He's one of my favorite people in ancient history. He is an Ostrogoth, which means he was culturally part of this group from Northern Europe that had really been outside the Roman orbit. Early in his life, he had been given as a hostage to the government in Constantinople, and he had actually grown up among Romans, so he was very Romanized in that sense. And when Zeno sent Theodoric out west to take over the government, presumably restore it to the control of the Byzantines, he didn't think he was choosing somebody from outside the Roman culture. But when Theodoric arrives in Rome, and he actually conquers Odoacer pretty quickly, he evidently says to himself, I could turn all this over to the Eastern Emperor, or I could just have my own kingdom. And he does indeed do that. He rules over the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. And again, it's not as if the people in the street really noticed any difference, because Theodoric was basically running the Roman government the way it had been run up to that point. He's not making any drastic changes. In fact, in the earlier part of his career, he seems to make a point of trying to do things the way the Romans had done them. You remember when the barbarians had first shown up on the scene, they were not trying to destroy Roman culture. They wanted to be part of it. They wanted to benefit from all the goodies that the Romans were able to take advantage of. The baths that you could go to and relax and have a good time, and the theaters where you could go see shows. And Theodoric wanted all that to go on. And later on in his life, Theodoric begins to turn against that for some reason. It's not really clear. And he starts having his Roman advisors executed. One of the last of the great Roman philosophers, Boethius, is put to death by Theodoric. And I don't know why, but I have the feeling that kind of, the Goth in him never quite died out. And for a while he was putting up with all of this Roman stuff. And then towards the end of his life, he may have just said to himself, okay, I've been good. I tried to be a Roman, but these people they're not gods, and I want to get rid of them. So he assassinated or had executed a lot of the Romans who used to work for him. Which, in the East, that was a problem because, not to begin with, Theodoric had not turned the government over to the Eastern Empire the way he was supposed to, but now he was kind of opposing himself to the Roman culture that he had more or less sworn to maintain. By this time, it is the beginning of the 500s, beginning of the 6th century, and a major emperor arises in the East, probably the most famous of the Byzantine emperors, a guy named Justinian. And it's interesting that I put on this sheet Justinian and his wife Theodora. I don't think I've ever had to mention in this class the wife of a Roman emperor before, because mostly the wives were not that important. But just Theodora was a power couple. Justinian and Theodora were two important people who were equally powerful in a way. In your textbook, I show there's a couple of photographs. I don't know, this is not a very sophisticated way of doing this, but these are photographs that exist in a church in Ravenna, which was the capital of the Western Empire, as I pointed out. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting is that these are portraits of Justinian and Theodora, and they're equivalent posses, and they are shown as equals. If you see a picture of the church that I'm talking about, there's one of the mosaics is on one side of the altar, one of the mosaics is on the other side of the altar, and they're equally large and equally visible. So Justinian, this was a kind of way for Justinian and Theodora to state that they were equal in power, and they really were. One of the reasons we know a lot about Justinian and Theodora is that there was the last of the great Greek historians, Procopius, who wrote three major works about them, actually. One of them was a history of the wars, which was sort of an official history of the military activities of Justinian in the 500s. And then he wrote a book which is very interesting called The Secret History, in which he dished the dirt, basically, about Justinian and Theodora. In the first work, The History of the Wars, he'd praised Justinian and Theodora and talked about how wonderful they were and what great things they'd done. And in the Secret History, he goes behind the scenes and he tells stories about the early lives of Justinian and Theodora, which were not at all regal or noble. They both came from pretty rough circumstances. The extent to which we can believe either of the different portraits that he gives of Justinian and Theodora is still debated. But what comes out from most of these stories is that they were both really tough characters. I mean, they were both people who didn't take anything from anybody. There's a wonderful story about at one point during Justinian's reign, there was a political upheaval called the Nike riots. It was basically people fighting in the streets in Constantinople, and Justinian gets scared, and he's packing his bags, literally. There's a boat waiting outside, and he's intending to get in it and take off and not have to deal with it. And his wife his wife Theodora says to him, "You're not going to do this. I didn't marry the kind of guy who is going to do this. You are going to stay here and ride it out." And in fact, he does. And he and Theodora continue to be in control. But it's a very untypical thing for a Roman wife or a Byzantine wife to be telling her husband what to do in that respect. So just even as a couple of co-rulers of the Byzantine Empire, they're interesting. And Procopius says some interesting things about the way they ruled together. They kind of played off each other. You know, sometimes when they were agreed on what would happen, but they weren't sure whether they would be able to convince the people of Constantinople, Justinian would say, well, you know, I don't really want this to happen, but Theodora wants it to happen. And you know, it's very hard to get her to change her mind about anything. When actually they were really both on the same side. They were just trying to play off each other in order to satisfy people that the situation was under control. Justinian did some important things as an emperor, and one of them was to bring together all the Roman law that had been established. You remember my saying earlier in the course that there had been a written law code really early on in the Roman Republic, actually 450 BCE, the 12 Tables. And as the history of the Roman Empire progressed, as people continued to bring up cases of law before the government, this accumulation of law happened, accumulation of legal precedent. But it wasn't codified into a single law book or series of books. So the decisions in one part of Rome might be contradicted by decisions in another part of Rome. And what Justinian, and actually people who were working for Justinian, did was to bring all of this Roman law together and decide, when two laws just contradicted each other, they decided which laws to go by. And this Corpus Juris Civilis is really the basis of modern European law. Over 1,000 years later, when Napoleon, for instance, had achieved the emperorship of France, and he decided that the legal system in France needed to be overhauled, he started with the Corpus Juris Civilis as a basis for action. So the Corpus Juris Civilis is an important aspect of modern law. It's the body of law that established concepts such as that people are innocent until proven guilty, that kind of thing. Another thing that Justinian did, which was not as successful, he tried to reconquer the parts of the Western Europe that had been once part of the Roman Empire, but had since, as I say, drifted off into other directions. He spent a lot of money sending Byzantine armies to try and reconquer Italy, North Africa. He actually made some good progress with that, but he wasn't able to hold on to it. After he dies, those areas drift out of the control of the Byzantine Empire again. And the great amount of money that Justinian spent trying to make this happen all turned out to be wasted, because basically after Justinian died, the situation reverted to what it had been before, and it left the Byzantine Empire economically desperate. So in the long run, it was not a good thing for the Byzantine Empire or for the Western Europe. But in the short term, it's sort of the last big pitch of any Roman emperor on either side to try and unify the situation. What we will see later on, actually beginning in the 600s, is the attempt of the Western popes in Rome to try and create a unified situation that will bring all Europe together. But that's a different kind of effort, and I'm going to be talking about it in a different lecture. So see you there soon. Bye.